Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something darker than your medicine cabinet and more twisted than your pharmacy receipt. Codeine. Not the fun party drug your cousin whispers about. I mean the actual legal doctor-prescribed opioid that's been hiding in cough syrup, painkillers, and grandma's nightstand for over a century. The one that somehow convinced the world it was safe, harmless, and totally fine to give to children. Spoiler alert, it absolutely was not. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to Sarah from Portland who suggested this topic. Your input literally shapes what we cover, and it means the world. The channel's now live on Spotify too, so check the link in the description if that's your thing. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe check the expiration date on that bottle of cough syrup you've had since 2008. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how an opioid, a literal relative of heroin, became something your pediatrician handed out like candy? How did pharmaceutical companies convince millions of people that addiction was just a side effect worth ignoring? What did it feel like to be a soldier in World War I, dosed with codeine and sent back to the trenches? Could you survive a century where pain relief and addiction were sold in the same bottle? Would you trust a drug that was marketed to kids, athletes, and your anxious Aunt Karen with equal enthusiasm? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1832. Codeine has just been isolated from opium for the first time. You have no idea what it does, no concept of addiction, and absolutely no clue that this molecule will quietly ruin millions of lives while making billions of dollars. Good luck. Long before codeine had a name, before it was isolated in labs or pressed into pills, it existed as a whisper inside the opium poppy, a plant as beautiful as it was dangerous. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, had been cultivated for thousands of years across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant. Egyptian priests used it in rituals. Chinese emperors sipped opium tea. But buried within its milky sap was more than just morphine. There was codeine, a quieter, subtler cousin. It wouldn't be discovered for centuries, but it was always there, waiting. In 1832, a French chemist named Pierre-Jean Robiquet was tinkering with opium extracts when he stumbled upon something new, a crystalline alkaloid he called codeine, derived from the Greek word codeia, meaning poppy head. It was less potent than morphine, which had been isolated decades earlier, but it was smoother, easier to tolerate, and far easier to justify prescribing. What Robiquet didn't know, what no one knew, was that he had just handed the world a drug that would become one of the most widely used and quietly addictive substances in medical history. At the time, the discovery felt like progress. Science was unlocking nature's secrets, one molecule at a time. Doctors were desperate for tools to fight pain and disease. Life expectancy was low, suffering was constant, and medicine was still fumbling in the dark with leeches, bloodletting, and prayers. So when Robiquet presented codeine to the medical community, they didn't see danger. They saw hope. The opium poppy itself had always been a double-edged sword. It grew wild and beautiful, its petals ranging from white to deep purple, its pods swelling with latex that could either heal or destroy. Farmers cultivated it alongside wheat and barley. Merchants traded it like spices, and physicians prescribed it liberally, often without understanding the full consequences. But codeine was different from raw opium. It was refined, controlled, scientific. It didn't have the thick, smoky stigma of opium dens or the dramatic reputation of morphine. It was respectable. And that respectability would allow it to slip into households, hospitals, and medicine cabinets across the globe with barely a whisper of concern. Robiquet probably died thinking he'd contributed something positive to humanity. He had no way of knowing that his crystalline discovery would spend the next 2 centuries quietly hooking millions of people, not in the dramatic needle-tracked way of heroin, but in the mundane, everyday way of a cough syrup or a pill bottle tucked into a purse. The opium poppy had always been generous with its gifts. Codeine was just the latest, wrapped in the illusion of safety. And the world was about to swallow it whole. By the mid-1800s, codeine was no longer just a laboratory curiosity. It was a medical marvel waiting to happen. Doctors were obsessed with finding new ways to treat pain, coughing, and diarrhea, the holy trinity of 19th century suffering. Codeine seemed perfect. It calmed coughs, eased mild pain, and didn't knock patients unconscious like morphine. It was marketed as the gentle option, the safe choice, the drug you could trust. Pharmaceutical companies loved it because it was cheap to produce and easy to dose. Patients loved it because it worked. And doctors, they handed it out like breath mints at a dinner party. But here's the kicker. No one was studying long-term effects. No one was asking what happened when you took codeine every day for months or years. The concept of addiction was still murky, often blamed on moral weakness rather than chemical dependency. If you couldn't stop taking a drug, well, that was your fault. You lacked discipline. You were morally deficient. The idea that your brain chemistry could be hijacked by a molecule, that wasn't part of the medical conversation yet. So codeine slipped quietly into medicine cabinets, cough syrups, and pharmacies across Europe and America, wrapped in the comfortable lie that it was harmless. Doctors prescribed it for everything: persistent coughs, post-surgical pain, menstrual cramps, headaches, even the vague malaise that Victorian-era physicians called nervous exhaustion. The beauty of codeine, from a medical perspective, was its versatility. It could be administered in powder form, dissolved in alcohol as an elixir, or mixed into syrups and tablets. It had a pleasant, slightly bitter taste that could be masked with sugar or flavouring. And because it was derived from the same plant as morphine but seemed less potent, doctors assumed it was safer. That assumption was wrong. But by the time anyone started connecting the dots, noticing that patients kept coming back for refills, that they became irritable or anxious when they ran out, that some couldn't seem to function without it, codeine had already embedded itself deep into medical practice. Pharmaceutical textbooks from the late 1800s praised codeine's effectiveness. Medical journals published glowing reports. And as the 20th century approached, codeine wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. A triumph of modern chemistry, a tool of compassionate medicine, a substance that allowed people to live with less suffering. What no one wanted to admit, what would take another century to fully acknowledge, was that codeine was solving one problem by creating another. It eased pain, yes, but it also created dependency, and that dependency, indeed quiet and manageable at first, had a way of growing teeth, slowly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to bite down. If you thought codeine's journey into your medicine cabinet was accidental, think again. By the late 1800s, pharmaceutical companies had figured out the golden recipe. Mix codeine with a little alcohol, some sugar, maybe a hint of cherry flavouring, and boom, you've got a cough syrup that people will buy by the gallon. Cough syrup became codeine's Trojan horse. It didn't look like a drug problem, it looked like health care. Mothers gave it to their children for colds, workers downed it before shifts, singers sipped it to soothe their throats, and because it was sold over the counter, no prescription needed, no one thought twice about it. More bottles of codeine-laced syrups lined pharmacy shelves with names that sounded wholesome and trustworthy. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Dr. Bell's pine tar honey, Brown's bronchial troches. The labels promised relief, comfort, and a good night's sleep. What they didn't mention was the codeine content, or the fact that you were essentially dosing yourself with a mild opioid every time you took a spoonful. The marketing was brilliant. Advertisements featured rosy-cheeked children, smiling mothers, and testimonials from satisfied customers who swore by the product. "I was coughing so hard I couldn't sleep," one ad claimed. "One bottle of Dr. Jameson's expectorant cured me completely." What it left out: the customer was now buying a bottle every week. By the early 1900s, codeine cough syrup was everywhere. It was socially acceptable, a doctor-recommended and quietly addictive. And the companies making it? They were getting very, very rich. Some became household names, expanding into other medications, building empires on the back of a simple fact: people who take codeine keep taking codeine. The alcohol content didn't hurt either. Many syrups were 10 to 20% alcohol, which meant you were getting a mild buzz along with your opioid. For people living in an era where life was hard, work was brutal, and entertainment was limited, a spoonful of cough syrup before bed wasn't just medicine. It was relief, it was escape, and children, they were dosed liberally. Teething babies were given soothing syrups laced with codeine and morphine. Toddlers with colds were given spoonfuls throughout the day. No one questioned it because everyone was doing it. And if a child became fussy when the bottle ran out, well, that just meant they needed more medicine. The cough syrup con wasn't a conspiracy. It was capitalism meeting chemistry, with a dash of ignorance and a heaping spoonful of denial. Companies weren't trying to addict people, not consciously anyway. They were just selling a product that worked. And if that product happened to create lifelong customers, well, that was just good business. By the time regulation started tightening in the early 20th century, the damage was done. An entire generation had grown up with codeine as a household staple. It was as normal as aspirin, as trusted as milk. And when people tried to stop taking it, when they realized they couldn't stop taking it, the excuse was always the same: but it's just cough syrup. When World War I erupted in 1914, soldiers faced horrors beyond imagination: trench warfare, gas attacks, infected wounds, and psychological trauma that had no name yet. And waiting in the medical tents, ready to numb the pain, was codeine. Military doctors loved it. Codeine was portable, stable, and effective. It could be administered in tablets, injections, or syrups. It eased the pain of shrapnel wounds, suppressed the hacking coughs caused by gas exposure, and helped soldiers sleep through the thunder of artillery. Unlike morphine, which could incapacitate a soldier, codeine allowed men to function while still dulling their agony. It was the perfect battlefield drug. But it also did something else. It created dependency. Soldiers who survived the front lines often came home with more than scars. They came home with habits, a need for codeine that didn't stop just because the war did. Some were given prescriptions, others bought it over the counter, and when they couldn't get codeine, they turned to morphine, heroin, or alcohol, anything to quiet the noise in their heads and the ache in their bones. The war made codeine a hero drug. Medical journals praised its effectiveness. Military doctors wrote glowing reports about how it kept soldiers operational despite horrific injuries. But behind those reports were thousands of men who couldn't sleep without it, who felt panic when they ran low, who discovered that the pain they were medicating wasn't just physical anymore. The term shell shock was coined during World War I to describe the psychological trauma soldiers experienced. But what doctors didn't fully understand yet was how physical pain, psychological trauma, and chemical dependency could intertwine. A soldier might start taking codeine for a leg wound, continue taking it for anxiety, and end up taking it just to feel normal. When the war ended in 1918, hundreds of thousands of soldiers returned home. Many were disabled, traumatized, unable to work, and many were dependent on opioids. But there was no system in place to help them. No addiction treatment programs, No understanding of withdrawal or dependency management, just shame, stigma, and the assumption that if you couldn't stop taking drugs, you were weak. Some soldiers hid their dependency. They lied to doctors to get prescriptions. They stole from pharmacies. They suffered in silence because admitting you needed codeine felt like admitting you were broken. And in a society that expected men to be stoic, strong, and silent about their suffering, being broken wasn't an option. The war had normalized opioid use in military medicine, but it had also created a generation of dependent veterans who would spend the rest of their lives chasing relief. Codeine, the gentle painkiller, had proven itself on the battlefield. But the soldiers who carried it home weren't celebrating. They were just trying to survive. Again. The 1920s were loud, reckless, and drenched in excess. Jazz filled the speakeasies, flappers danced until dawn, and prohibition turned alcohol into a black market treasure. But while everyone focused on bootleg gin, another substance was quietly weaving its way into American culture: codeine. It was legal, accessible, and respectable. You didn't need to visit a shady dealer. You walked into a pharmacy, coughed twice, and walked out with a bottle. Codeine became part of the lifestyle, used by performers to soothe their throats, by workers to dull chronic pain, and by socialites who discovered that a spoonful before bed made the world feel softer. It wasn't called addiction, it was called self-care. The 20s were also the era of patent medicines, elixirs sold with grand promises and zero regulation. Many contained codeine, often in combination with alcohol, cocaine, or other substances. Bottles promised to cure everything from melancholy to exhaustion to female troubles, and people bought them by the case, musicians in particular, and embraced codeine. Jazz singers and blues performers dealt with grueling schedules, smoky venues, and voices pushed to their limits. Codeine soothed raw throats and calmed frayed nerves. It became an open secret in the clubs. Everyone knew someone who kept a bottle backstage. It wasn't scandalous, it was practical. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. Doctors began noticing patterns. Patients who kept coming back for refills, who complained of withdrawal symptoms when they stopped, who seemed fine on the outside but were quietly unravelling on the inside. Emergency room visits for nervous collapse often revealed a patient who'd been taking codeine daily for years. The Roaring Twenties roared partly because people were medicated enough to ignore the pain. The economy was booming, but so was inequality. The war was over, but trauma lingered, and codeine offered a convenient way to cope, legal, affordable, and socially acceptable. Still, the medical establishment largely shrugged. Codeine was safe, they said. It wasn't like heroin or morphine. It was mild, manageable, medicinal. The fact that patients couldn't stop taking it? Well, that was probably because they still needed it. Pain was real after all, and if codeine was helping, why would you stop? This logic would persist for decades. If a patient was taking a drug regularly, it must be because they needed it, not because they were dependent on it. The idea that need and dependency could be two different things hadn't quite sunk in yet. Or maybe it had, and people just didn't want to admit it. By the time the 20s crashed into the Great Depression, codeine was firmly entrenched in American life. Yet it had survived prohibition, medical scrutiny, and the beginning whispers of concern. And as the economy collapsed and suffering became universal, codeine sales didn't drop. They rose. Because when life gets hard, people reach for relief, and codeine, more than almost any other drug in history, had perfected the art of looking harmless while quietly taking hold. By the 1930s, even the most optimistic doctors couldn't ignore the problem anymore. Codeine was addictive. Not in the dramatic needle-in-the-arm way that morphine and heroin were, but in a quieter, more insidious way. People weren't overdosing in alleys, they were just taking it, every day, for years. And when they tried to stop, their bodies screamed. The newly formed Food and Drug Administration began paying attention. In 1938, the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act was passed, giving the FDA more power to regulate medications. Codeine was placed under tighter restrictions, not banned but controlled. Prescriptions were now required for higher doses. Over-the-counter sales were limited to lower concentrations, and even then, some states required you to sign a logbook at the pharmacy. It was a step in the right direction, but only a tiny one. Because here's the thing, codeine was already everywhere. It was baked into the medical system, embedded in cultural habits, and far too profitable to just pull off the shelves. Pharmaceutical companies pushed back hard, arguing that codeine was essential for public health, that restricting it would cause unnecessary suffering. And to some extent they were right. Codeine did help people, but it also hooked them. The FDA's approach was frustratingly cautious. They acknowledged the risk of dependency but framed it as something that only happened to people who misused the drug. If you took it exactly as prescribed, you'd be fine. This was, of course, completely untrue. Plenty of people became dependent while following their doctor's orders to the letter, but admitting that would mean admitting that the medical system itself was creating addicts. So the FDA compromised. They regulated just enough to look like they were doing something, but not so much that it disrupted the pharmaceutical industry or upset doctors. Codeine remained available over the counter in low doses. It stayed in cough syrups, pain medications and combination pills, and people kept taking it. The regulations did have one unintended consequence. They created a black market. When something becomes harder to get legally, people find other ways. Pharmacists who were willing to look the other way made extra money selling codeine under the table. Doctors who wrote generous prescriptions found themselves suddenly popular, and patients who needed or thought they needed codeine learned how to work the system. The FDA's half-hearted regulations were like putting a screen door on a submarine, technically there, but not really stopping anything. Codeine kept flowing, just with a little more paperwork. And the message sent to the public was clear. Codeine is dangerous enough to regulate, but not dangerous enough to really worry about. It's fine, probably. Just don't take too much, whatever too much means. For the next few decades, this would be the pattern. Regulations would tighten slightly. Either pharmaceutical companies would adjust their marketing, and codeine would continue its quiet reign as the opioid no one wanted to talk about. Because talking about it meant admitting how many people were dependent on it. And that number, even in the 1930s, was already staggering. When World War II broke out, codeine once again became a military staple. Soldiers needed pain relief, medics needed portable solutions, and codeine checked every box. It was issued in field kits, stocked in hospital ships, and distributed across battlefields from Europe to the Pacific. If World War I had introduced codeine to military medicine, World War II industrialized it. But this time, the scale was different. Millions of soldiers, millions of doses. And when the war ended in 1945, those soldiers came home, in many of them with injuries, trauma, and a prescription for codeine that didn't stop just because the fighting did. The post-war boom saw a surge in pharmaceutical production. Codeine was no longer just a wartime necessity. It became a peacetime commodity. It was marketed to veterans, to factory workers, to mothers dealing with postpartum pain. The message was clear. You've suffered enough. You deserve relief. And for many, that relief came in a little white pill with a C stamped on it. But the war had also done something else. It had normalized opioid use on a massive scale. Pain management became a medical priority, not just for acute injuries, but for chronic conditions. Doctors who had served in the military came home with a new philosophy. Pain should be treated aggressively, immediately, and without hesitation. Codeine fit that philosophy perfectly. Veterans' hospitals prescribed it liberally. VA doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer number of disabled soldiers, relied on codeine to manage everything from amputated limbs to chronic headaches to the unnamed psychological pain that we now call PTSD. It was easier to write a prescription than to sit with a soldier and process his trauma, and codeine was cheap, effective, and readily available. The pharmaceutical industry expanded rapidly in the post-war years. Companies that had produced medications for the military now turned their attention to the civilian market, and they had a product that practically sold itself, a painkiller that worked, that patients asked for by name, that doctors trusted. Codeine production skyrocketed. By the 1950s, codeine was more than a drug, and it was infrastructure. It was woven into the fabric of medical practice, prescribed routinely for surgeries, dental work, sports injuries, and chronic conditions. And because it had been so successful during the war, few people questioned it. But beneath the surface, dependency rates were climbing. Veterans who had started taking codeine in field hospitals found themselves unable to stop years later. Workers who'd been prescribed it for a back injury discovered they needed it just to get through the day, and families, mothers, fathers, children began organizing their lives around prescription refills. The war had proven codeine's value on the battlefield, but it had also created a generation of people who couldn't imagine life without it. And as those people aged, had children, and passed on their habits and assumptions, and codeine became not just a drug but a legacy, one that would haunt families for generations. By the 1950s and 60s, codeine had become a cash cow. Pharmaceutical companies were churning out codeine-based medications at an astonishing rate. Tylenol with codeine, Robitussin AC, Furanol with codeine, Empirin with codeine, and dozens of others. Each one promised relief, from headaches, from coughs, from back pain, from life itself. The marketing was genius. Codeine wasn't sold as a drug, it was sold as a lifestyle upgrade. Ads showed smiling housewives, productive workers, and happy families, all thanks to a little chemical assistance. One advertisement from the 1960s featured a woman vacuuming while her children played quietly nearby. The caption read, "When pain threatened to ruin her day, she reached for relief." The fine print mentioned codeine. The image suggested domestic bliss was just a pill away. Doctors were encouraged, sometimes incentivized, to prescribe it. Pharmaceutical sales representatives visited medical offices with free samples, glossy brochures, and studies, often funded by the same companies, that downplayed addiction risks. The message was consistent. Codeine was effective, well tolerated, and safe for long-term use. Any concerns about dependency were dismissed as rare exceptions, the result of patient misuse rather than the drug's inherent properties. And patients. They loved it. It worked. It made them feel better. And if they needed it every day, well, that was just modern medicine doing its job. The idea that feeling better today might mean feeling worse tomorrow, that relief now meant dependency later, wasn't part of the conversation. Behind the scenes, however, researchers were beginning to understand just how codeine worked. It metabolized in the liver into morphine. Yes, actual morphine, which meant that every dose of codeine was essentially a mini dose of one of the most addictive substances known to humanity. Studies showed this clearly. The science was published in medical journals, discussed at conferences, and understood by pharmacologists. But that information didn't make it into the glossy brochures or the TV commercials. Instead, it was buried in medical journals that only specialists read. The truth was inconvenient, unprofitable, and easy to ignore, so they did. The pharmaceutical industry in the mid-20th century was a printing press for money, and codeine was one of the bills being printed. Companies that specialized in codeine medications saw their stock prices soar. Executives received bonuses, shareholders celebrated, and all the while, in homes across America and around the world, People were opening their medicine cabinets and reaching for their pills, unaware that they were participating in one of the largest mass dependencies in human history. The truly insidious part was how normalized it became. Codeine wasn't something you hid. It wasn't shameful. It sat on your bathroom shelf next to the toothpaste and the Band-Aids. You mentioned it casually to friends. "Oh, I've got a splitting headache. Good thing I have my Tylenol 3. No one batted an eye. No one asked how long you'd been taking it. No one suggested you might have a problem. And why would they? The pharmaceutical companies had done their job perfectly. They'd taken an opioid, dressed it up in respectable packaging, marketed it as medicine rather than a drug, and convinced an entire society that dependency was just consistent pain management. It was brilliant, it was profitable, and it was destroying people slowly enough that no one noticed until it was far too late. One of the darkest chapters in codeine's history is how casually, how recklessly it was given to children. For decades, pediatricians prescribed codeine for everything: post-surgical pain, severe coughs, even teething discomfort. Parents trusted it because doctors recommended it. And doctors recommended it because that's what they'd always done. Codeine was considered the pediatric painkiller of choice. After tonsillectomies, which were performed routinely on millions of children throughout the 20th century, doctors sent kids home with bottles of codeine elixir. The instructions were simple: 1 teaspoon every 4 to 6 hours for pain. What the instructions didn't mention was that some children's bodies would convert that codeine into dangerously high levels of morphine. But children metabolize codeine differently than adults. Some kids are ultra-rapid metabolizers, meaning their bodies convert codeine into morphine at dangerous speeds. For them, a standard dose could become a lethal overdose, and it happened. More than once. More than anyone wants to count. Case reports began surfacing quietly in medical literature throughout the 2000s. A 2-year-old who stopped breathing after routine ear surgery. A 5-year-old found unresponsive in bed 3 days after a tonsillectomy. A 7-year-old who slipped into a coma after being given codeine for a persistent cough. In each case, the initial response was confusion. The dosing had been correct. The parents had followed instructions. What went wrong? The answer was genetics. The CYP2D6 enzyme, responsible for converting codeine to morphine, varies wildly between individuals. Some people lack it entirely, making codeine ineffective. Others have multiple copies of the gene, making them ultra-rapid metabolizers. For these children, even a small dose of codeine could flood their system with morphine, suppressing their breathing until they simply stopped. By the early 2000s, the evidence was impossible to ignore. The FDA received reports of pediatric deaths linked to codeine, and medical examiners found dangerous levels of morphine in children who had been given standard doses. Researchers published studies showing the genetic variability in codeine metabolism, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the medical establishment began to respond. In 2012, the FDA issued a black box warning, the strongest warning possible, against giving codeine to children after tonsillectomy or adenoidectomy. It was a start, but only a start. Codeine was still being prescribed for other pediatric uses. It was still available in cough syrups marketed to children, and many doctors, either unaware of the warnings or dismissive of them, continued prescribing it. In 2017, the FDA went further, recommending that codeine not be used in anyone under 12, and that it be used with caution in adolescents aged 12 to 18. The American Academy of Pediatrics echoed this recommendation. Finally, after decades of use and countless preventable deaths, the medical community was admitting what should have been obvious from the start. Giving an opioid with unpredictable effects to children was a terrible idea. But the damage was done. How many children suffered in the meantime? How many families were told their child's death was a freak accident, a tragic but unavoidable complication, when it was actually a preventable tragedy caused by a drug that should never have been prescribed? The answer is too many. And codeine's reputation as a safe, gentle drug took a hit. It probably should have taken decades earlier. Parents who had trusted their doctors, who had given their children the prescribed medicine exactly as directed, now lived with guilt and rage. Some filed lawsuits, others became advocates, pushing for stronger regulations and better genetic screening. And all of them carried the same question: how did this happen? How did we give opioids to children for so long without anyone stopping to ask if it was safe? The answer, as always, was a combination of profit, inertia, and willful ignorance. Codeine worked. It was cheap. And admitting it was dangerous meant admitting that generations of doctors had been wrong. So instead, the medical community moved slowly, reluctantly, only changing course when the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore, and by then too many small coffins had already been lowered into the ground. Here's the uncomfortable truth. For most of the 20th century, codeine addiction was an open secret. Doctors knew, pharmacists knew, patients knew. But no one wanted to say it out loud because admitting codeine was addictive meant admitting that millions of people had been prescribed a dependency in a bottle. Codeine addiction didn't look like heroin addiction. There were no needles, no back alleys, no dramatic interventions. It looked like someone who always had a prescription, who always seemed to have a cough, who got anxious when they were running low. It looked normal, and that was the problem. People became dependent on codeine while living perfectly ordinary lives. They went to work, raised families, paid taxes, and quietly, privately needed their pills. Some took them exactly as prescribed and still couldn't stop. The others escalated, taking more than recommended, doctor shopping for multiple prescriptions, lying about lost bottles or increased pain. And when codeine wasn't enough anymore, they moved on to stronger opioids, to morphine, to oxycodone, to heroin. Codeine wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was just the beginning. The gateway drug that no one wanted to call a gateway because it was legal, prescribed, and profitable. The language around codeine addiction was carefully sanitized. Doctors didn't call it addiction. They called it tolerance or physical dependence, as if those were fundamentally different things. Patients weren't addicts. They were chronic pain patients, or people with persistent symptoms. The terminology created distance from the reality that these were people whose brain chemistry had been hijacked by a drug they'd been told was safe. Support groups for codeine addiction barely existed. Alcoholics Anonymous welcomed people dependent on alcohol. Narcotics Anonymous was for heroin users, but codeine, that was prescribed by doctors. That was medicine. So where did you go when you realized you couldn't stop taking your medicine? Nowhere. You suffered alone, convinced you were uniquely weak, uniquely flawed. The shame was profound. People who would never touch illegal drugs, who had strong moral convictions about substance abuse, found themselves unable to function without codeine. They hid bottles in their cars, their desks, their coat pockets. They counted pills obsessively, planning their days around dosing schedules. They lied to doctors, to family members, to themselves, and the medical system enabled it. Prescription monitoring programs didn't exist yet. Doctors rarely communicated with each other about shared patients. Pharmacies filled prescriptions without question. It was perfectly possible to see 3 different doctors, get 3 different prescriptions, and fill them all at different pharmacies without anyone noticing. The system was designed for convenience, not safety. Even when families noticed something was wrong, when mum seemed foggy all the time, when dad got irritable if his prescription was late, they didn't know what to do. Interventions were for alcoholics and drug addicts, not for someone taking prescribed medication. So they said nothing, or they confronted gently, and nothing changed. The addiction no one wanted to name was also the addiction no one wanted to treat. Addiction treatment programs focused on illegal drugs. Insurance companies didn't cover long-term treatment for prescription drug dependency. And doctors, the very people who had prescribed the codeine in the first place, were often reluctant to help patients taper off because it was time-consuming, uncomfortable, and opened them up to liability. So people stayed stuck, taking their pills, refilling their prescriptions, living in the grey zone between pain management and dependency. Some eventually hit bottom, lost jobs, broken relationships, health crises, and found their way to recovery. But many didn't. They just kept going, year after year, their lives shrinking around a pill bottle, telling themselves it was fine, it was medicine, it wasn't a problem. And until one day, they realized it absolutely was. And by then, getting out felt impossible. Fast forward to the 1990s and early 2000s, and codeine cough syrup had evolved from a medical staple into something else entirely, a cultural phenomenon. In hip-hop communities, particularly in the southern United States, mixing prescription cough syrup with soda and candy became known as lean, scissorp, or purple drank. It started in Houston, Texas, where DJ Screw pioneered a style of music called chopped and screwed, slowed down beats that matched the sluggish, dreamy high of codeine and promethazine. The syrup, typically Actavis or high-tech brand, was mixed with Sprite and Jolly Ranchers, creating a sweet purple drink that became a status symbol in certain circles. It was glamorized in music, videos, and by celebrities who sipped it like it was champagne. Rappers referenced it in their lyrics. Music videos showed styrofoam cups filled with purple liquid. It became part of the aesthetic, slow, relaxed, unbothered. But it wasn't champagne. It was codeine and promethazine, an antihistamine that amplified the sedative effects. The combination slowed breathing, lowered heart rate, and created a euphoric, detached high that users described as floating. It also killed people. DJ Screw himself died in 2000 from a codeine overdose. Pimp C, a founding member of UGK, died in 2007 from respiratory depression caused by codeine and sleep apnea. And later, in 2017, Lil Peep died from a combination of fentanyl and Xanax, but his well-documented struggles with codeine abuse were part of a larger pattern. But the culture around it persisted, fueled by a mix of accessibility, celebrity endorsement, and a dangerous misconception that because it was prescribed, it was safe. Young people saw their favourite artists sipping lean and assumed it was harmless fun, a party drug, something you could control. They didn't see the addiction, the overdoses, the emergency room visits, the deaths that happened off camera. Pharmacies began tightening restrictions. Some states required prescriptions for any cough syrup containing codeine. Doctors became more cautious about prescribing it. But by then, the damage was done. An entire generation had been introduced to opioid use not through pills, but through a drink that tasted like candy and was celebrated in songs. The internet made it worse. Forums and social media taught people how to sip safely, what brands to use, how much to mix, but there's no safe way to abuse opioids. The line between a recreational dose and a lethal one is thin, and it varies wildly between individuals based on tolerance, metabolism, and what else is in your system. Emergency rooms across the South reported surges in codeine-related admissions. Young people, teenagers, college students, brought in unconscious, lips blue, barely breathing. Some were revived with naloxone, others weren't, and their families were left devastated, confused about how cough syrup could kill their child. The codeine cough syrup epidemic was a perfect storm of accessibility, cultural glamorization, and ignorance. It took a substance that had been used medically for over a century and turned it into a recreational drug, and once again, codeine proved that it didn't matter how you packaged it, how you marketed it, or what you called it. An opioid is an opioid, and opioids, when misused, kill. By the 2010s, the glorification of lean in hip-hop began to shift. More artists spoke openly about their struggles with addiction. Some quit publicly. Others warned their fans. The cultural conversation started to change. Not fast enough, never fast enough, but it changed. Lean went from being cool to being tragic. And codeine cough syrup once again revealed itself for what it had always been: dangerous, addictive, and deadly. While the United States grappled with its opioid crisis, codeine was quietly spreading across the globe. In countries like India, Nigeria, Pakistan, and South Africa, codeine-based cough syrups were sold over the counter with minimal regulation. It was cheap, effective, and devastatingly addictive. In Nigeria, codeine abuse became a national crisis by the 2010s. Young people, particularly in the northern states, were consuming bottles of codeine syrup daily. Not for medical reasons, for the high. The same high that American rappers had popularized was now gripping Nigerian youth. But in Nigeria, access was even easier. You could walk into a pharmacy and buy as many bottles as you wanted, no questions asked. The scale was staggering. Millions of bottles were being sold annually. Entire communities were affected. Young men, some as young as 14, became dependent. Their lives revolved around getting their next bottle. They dropped out of school, stopped working, and spent what little money they had on syrup. Families were torn apart. Parents watched their children deteriorate, unable to stop them because the drug was legal and available on every corner. Investigative journalists documented the crisis. They found pharmacies selling codeine by the crate, manufacturers producing millions of bottles annually, and regulatory agencies that either didn't care or were too overwhelmed to act. The BBC produced a documentary that shocked the world, showing young Nigerian men drinking bottle after bottle, slurring their words, barely able to stand. In 2018, the Nigerian government finally acted. They banned the production and import of codeine cough syrup entirely. It was a drastic measure, but it was necessary. Within months, codeine-related hospital admissions dropped, but the damage had been done. Thousands of young people were already addicted, facing withdrawal with little to no support. In India, codeine remained available in combination medications, often mixed with paracetamol or ibuprofen. But abuse was rampant, particularly among young men who used it recreationally. Overdoses spiked, emergency rooms filled, families shattered, and yet regulations remained weak. The pharmaceutical lobby was too powerful, and the government too slow to act. South Africa saw similar patterns. Codeine cough syrup became a street drug, sold informally, mixed with other substances, and consumed by young people chasing a cheap high. Public health officials raised alarms, but change was slow, and in countries across Africa and Asia, where healthcare infrastructure was already strained, codeine addiction became yet another burden on systems that couldn't handle it. Addiction treatment programs were scarce or non-existent. Families were left to deal with it alone, and young people caught in the grip of dependency had nowhere to turn. The global codeine crisis wasn't an accident. It was the result of decades of unchecked pharmaceutical expansion, weak regulations, and the same old lie that codeine was safe. Companies that couldn't sell as much codeine in heavily regulated Western markets simply shifted their focus to developing countries where regulations were lax and profits were high. It was exploitation dressed up as healthcare, and it left a trail of addiction, overdose, and broken lives across the developing world. Countries that were already struggling with poverty, disease, and instability now had to contend with an opioid epidemic fueled by a drug that Western nations were finally starting to regulate. The injustice was profound, and the suffering, as always, fell on the most vulnerable. Let's get into the biology for a second, because understanding how codeine works is key to understanding why it's so dangerous. When you take codeine, your liver converts it into morphine through a process called odemethylation, carried out by an enzyme called CYP2D6. Once converted, that morphine binds to opioid receptors in your brain and spinal cord, blocking pain signals and flooding your system with dopamine, the feel-good chemical. Your brain loves dopamine. It's the chemical reward for doing things that keep you alive: eating, sleeping, socializing, reproducing. When your brain gets a hit of dopamine, it says, yes, more of that. And if you keep feeding it codeine, your brain starts to adapt. It produces less natural dopamine, relying instead on the drug. Neurons adjust their receptor density. The reward pathways rewire themselves. Your brain's entire chemistry shifts to accommodate the presence of the drug. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change based on experience. It's normally a good thing. It's how we learn, adapt, and grow. But when it comes to drugs, neuroplasticity becomes a trap. Your brain adapts so thoroughly to the presence of codeine that it starts to need it just to function normally. Tolerance builds. The dose that used to make you feel better now just makes you feel okay, so you take more, and the cycle continues, your brain chasing a baseline that keeps moving further away. And when you try to stop, withdrawal. This isn't just psychological. It's not about willpower or wanting it badly enough. Withdrawal is your brain and body screaming for the chemical they've come to depend on. Sweating, shaking, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle aches, anxiety, insomnia, pain, your nervous system in full revolt. The pain during withdrawal is often worse than the original pain you were treating. This is called hyperalgesia, increased sensitivity to pain caused by opioid use. Your nervous system has been suppressed for so long that when the drug is removed, it rebounds with a vengeance. Everything hurts. Even things that shouldn't hurt. Your skin feels raw, your bones ache, your head pounds, and the psychological symptoms, crushing, depression, anxiety, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from anything. Food tastes like cardboard. Music sounds flat. Nothing brings joy because your brain's reward system has been hijacked and can't function without the drug. This isn't weakness, it's chemistry. And for decades, that chemistry was either misunderstood, ignored, or deliberately downplayed by the people profiting from codeine's sale. The science was always there. Researchers in the 1960s understood how opioids affected the brain. By the 1980s, the mechanisms of addiction were well documented. The warning signs were always there, but money, convenience, and denial kept codeine in circulation long after it should have been pulled back. Pharmaceutical companies buried unfavorable studies. Medical schools barely taught addiction medicine, and doctors trained to treat pain aggressively and prescribed opioids without fully understanding the dependency they were creating. The science of dependency isn't complicated. It's elegant, actually, a clear demonstration of how the brain adapts to its chemical environment. But that elegance doesn't make it any less devastating. Because once those neural pathways are rewired, reversing them takes time, support, and often medication-assisted treatment. And for too long, none of those things were readily available to people dependent on codeine. One of codeine's cruelest tricks was how it trapped people who were just trying to follow their doctor's orders. You go in with a sprained back, a persistent cough, a dental procedure. Your doctor hands you a prescription for Tylenol with codeine or a bottle of codeine-containing cough syrup. You take it as directed. It works. The pain fades. The cough quiets. You feel better. Then the prescription runs out, and suddenly you don't feel better. In fact, you feel worse. Your pain comes back worse than before. You feel anxious, irritable, restless. Your hands shake slightly. You can't sleep. Your stomach is in knots. You're sweating even though you're cold. and you have no idea why. So you call your doctor, ask for a refill, maybe you feel embarrassed like you're being weak, but the doctor doesn't hesitate. They give you another prescription because you're not a drug seeker. You're a patient in pain. You're doing exactly what they told you to do. The problem is, you're also now dependent, and you didn't choose it. You didn't abuse anything. You just trusted your doctor, followed the label, and ended up in a chemical trap. This happened to millions of people. Teachers, nurses, construction workers, retirees, stay-at-home parents, people who would never think of themselves as addicts, but who found themselves unable to function without their pills. They didn't take codeine to get high. They took it to not feel awful. But the distinction didn't matter. Their brain chemistry had changed. They were dependent. And when doctors finally cut them off, afraid of liability, responding to new regulations, or simply uncomfortable with the pattern, many turned to the black market. They bought pills from friends. They found online pharmacies. They doctor shopped, visiting multiple physicians to get multiple prescriptions. Not because they were addicts seeking a high, but because they were in withdrawal and desperate to feel normal again. Some, when they couldn't get codeine anymore, turned to stronger opioids, oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, and when those became too expensive or too hard to find, they turned to heroin, because once your brain is hooked on opioids, it doesn't care where they come from. It just knows it needs them, and heroin, despite being illegal and dangerous, was often cheaper and easier to get than prescription pills. This was the prescription trap. Enter through the front door of legitimate medicine, get dependent without knowing it, then get cut off and pushed toward the street. The pathway from codeine prescription to heroin use was well documented by the 2000s. Studies showed that people who became addicted to prescription opioids were 40 times more likely to use heroin than people who didn't. Codeine wasn't always the first step, but it was often in the chain. The tragedy was that most of these people never intended to become addicted. They weren't reckless. They weren't seeking escape. They were just following medical advice, trusting the system, and believing that prescription meant safe. The prescription trap broke that trust. It turned medicine into a gateway, doctors into unwitting dealers, and patients into casualties of a system that prioritized short-term relief over long-term safety. And when those patients finally realized what had happened, when they understood that their dependency wasn't a moral failing but a predictable result of taking an addictive drug, the shame didn't disappear. It just got mixed with anger. Anger at doctors who should have known better. Anger at pharmaceutical companies who did know better and didn't care. And anger at a system that created addicts and then abandoned them. For decades, regulating codeine has been a frustrating game of back and forth between public health officials, pharmaceutical companies, and lawmakers. On one side, doctors, researchers, and addiction specialists screaming that codeine is dangerous, that it's fueling dependency, that it needs stricter controls. On the other side, pharmaceutical lobbies, medical groups concerned about pain management, and chronic pain advocates, arguing that codeine is essential, that overregulation will harm patients, that access must be preserved. The result? A patchwork of regulations that vary wildly by country, by state, even by pharmacy. In some places, codeine is available over the counter in low-dose combinations. In others, it requires prescription for any amount. In a few countries, it's been banned entirely. And within countries like the United States, codeine can be Schedule 2, Schedule 3, or Schedule 5, depending on its concentration and what it's combined with. It's confusing, inconsistent, and easy to exploit. Someone denied a prescription in one state can drive across the border and try again. Someone cut off by one doctor can find another. The lack of uniformity creates gaps that people struggling with dependency can slip through, sometimes desperately seeking relief, sometimes manipulating the system. In the United States, the Drug Enforcement Administration classifies pure codeine and high-dose combinations as Schedule II, the same category as oxycodone and morphine, recognizing high abuse potential. But lower dose combinations, like those mixed with acetaminophen or aspirin, are Schedule III, and very low-dose codeine cough syrups used to be Schedule V, requiring minimal controls. This tiered system was supposed to balance access with safety, but it mostly just created confusion. Throughout all of this, codeine kept being prescribed, kept being sold, and kept hooking people. The regulatory tug-of-war wasn't really about science or safety. It was about money, politics, and the uncomfortable reality that admitting codeine was dangerous meant admitting decades of medical practice had been wrong. Pharmaceutical companies employed powerful lobbyists. They funded research that minimized addiction risks. They sponsored medical conferences where doctors were taught to treat pain aggressively. They donated to politicians who opposed stricter regulations, and when regulations did tighten, they simply shifted their marketing to other countries with weaker oversight. I'll continue with the remaining segments in the next response to manage length. Would you like me to continue? Codeine didn't just live in medicine cabinets, it lived in the cultural imagination. From the codeine-laced cough syrups of the jazz age to the lean-sipping rappers of the 2000s, codeine has always had a presence in music, film, and art, sometimes glamorized, sometimes vilified, but never ignored. In the 60s and 70s, rock musicians whispered about purple pills and cough syrup highs. The Rolling Stones referenced drugs obliquely in their lyrics. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and countless others battled substance abuse publicly, and while heroin and alcohol got most of the attention, prescription drugs were always part of the mix. Codeine was there in the background, respectable enough to keep taking, dangerous enough to keep you hooked. In the 90s, Southern rap made lean a symbol of a certain lifestyle, slow, smooth, detached. Houston became the epicenter of this culture. DJ Screw's chopped and screwed music was literally designed to sound like you were listening to it while high on codeine. The tempo slowed to a crawl, voices deepened and stretched, and the whole sonic landscape became thick and syrupy, like the drink itself. Songs like Sippin' on Some Syrup by 3-6 Mafia didn't just reference codeine, they celebrated it. The music videos showed rappers with styrofoam cups, purple liquid sloshing inside, a visual shorthand for success, relaxation, and a certain kind of street credibility. For young fans, especially in the South, lean became aspirational. If your favourite rapper sipped it, it must be cool, it must be safe, it must be something you could control. Films depicted addicts not as villains but as tragic figures, caught in cycles they couldn't escape. Movies like Requiem for a Dream and Trainspotting showed the devastation of drug addiction, though they focused more on heroin and amphetamines. Codeine, being prescription and seemingly milder, often escaped the darker portrayals. It was the drug people took before they graduated to the really scary stuff, but slowly the cultural narrative began to shift. As more celebrities died, DJ Screw in 2000, Pimp C in 2007, Lil Peep in 2017, the conversation finally began to change. Suddenly lean wasn't cool anymore, it was tragic, it was a killer. Artists who had once glorified it started speaking out against it. Future, one of the biggest rappers of the 2010s, built much of his early career on references to codeine use. But by 2019, he was publicly discussing his struggles with addiction and the damage it had caused. He didn't glamorize it anymore, he owned up to the cost. Other artists followed suit. The cultural pendulum was swinging. Pop culture didn't create the codeine crisis, but it reflected it, amplified it, and sometimes accidentally normalized it. When a drug appears in songs, movies, and art, it becomes part of the cultural vocabulary. Young people, who might never have thought about codeine suddenly knew what it was, what it did, and where to get it. And when celebrities started dying, publicly, tragically, with toxicology reports splashed across headlines, the conversation finally began to shift in earnest. Codeine went from being a safe, boring painkiller to being recognised as what it always was, an opioid, dangerous, addictive, and capable of killing you just as dead as heroin ever could. The legacy in pop culture is mixed. On one hand, the glamorization of lean introduced countless young people to opioid abuse. On the other hand, the very public consequences, the deaths, the addiction stories, the cautionary tales, eventually became a warning. Codeine was part of the soundtrack of several generations, and for too many of those people, it became the soundtrack to their funerals. By the 2010s, the opioid crisis was impossible to ignore. Tens of thousands of Americans were dying every year from opioid overdoses, and while much of the focus was on oxycodone, fentanyl and heroin, codeine was still quietly playing its part. Codeine overdoses were less dramatic than fentanyl deaths, but they happened, especially among people who underestimated it, who thought it was weak, who mixed it with alcohol or other sedatives. The combination was often lethal. Codeine plus alcohol equals respiratory depression. Your breathing slows, your heart rate drops, your body shuts down, and if no one finds you in time, you don't wake up. Respiratory depression, the slowing of breathing until it stops entirely, was the primary cause of death in codeine overdoses. People would take codeine, feel drowsy, lie down, and never wake up. Their breathing would slow gradually, then stop. Sometimes they'd vomit and aspirate, choking on their own stomach contents. Sometimes their heart would simply give out. Emergency rooms saw it constantly. Patients brought in unconscious, lips blue, barely breathing. Naloxone would be administered, the opioid reversal drug that could bring people back from the brink. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they'd wake up gasping, confused, angry even, because naloxone doesn't just reverse the overdose, it throws you into instant withdrawal. Other times, it was too late. The patient had been down too long. Brain damage had already occurred, or they couldn't be revived at all, and the tragedy was that many of these deaths were preventable. If people understood the risks, if warnings were clearer, if codeine wasn't so easy to get, if doctors were better trained in recognizing dependency and overdose risk, if there was less stigma around calling for help when someone was in trouble. But for too long, codeine existed in a grey zone. It wasn't scary like heroin. It wasn't notorious like oxycodone. It was just codeine, grandma's cough syrup, the pills you got after dental surgery. Nothing to worry about, except it absolutely was something to worry about, and people were dying because they didn't know that until it was too late. The overdose crisis also revealed another problem: polypharmacy. Many people who died with codeine in their system weren't taking it alone. They were combining it with benzodiazepines, alcohol, antihistamines, or other sedatives. Each drug on its own might not be lethal, but together they created a synergistic effect, the respiratory depression from one drug amplified by another until breathing stopped entirely. Doctors often didn't know what else their patients were taking. Electronic health records weren't always shared between providers. Prescription monitoring programs were inconsistent or non-existent in many states. A patient could get codeine from one doctor, Xanax from another, and Ambien from a third, and none of them would know about the others unless the patient volunteered the information, which most didn't, either out of embarrassment, fear of being cut off, or genuine ignorance about the risks. The overdose crisis forced a reckoning. Public health officials began pushing for prescription drug monitoring programs in every state. Doctors received training on safer prescribing practices. Pharmacies started flagging suspicious patterns, and naloxone became more widely available distributed to first responders, and sold over the counter in some states, and even given to family members of people at risk. But prevention was always better than reversal, and preventing codeine overdoses meant acknowledging what had been true all along. Codeine was an opioid. It carried risks, and those risks had been systematically downplayed for over a century. The overdose crisis was the bill coming due, and it was paid in lives. Behind every pill bottle there's a corporation, and behind every corporation pushing opioids, there's usually a trail of deception, manipulation, and profit over people. Codeine was no exception. Pharmaceutical companies knew codeine was addictive. Internal documents, later revealed through lawsuits and investigations, showed that they were aware of dependency risks as early as the 1950s. These studies conducted by their own researchers documented withdrawal symptoms, tolerance development, and abuse potential. But instead of pulling back, they doubled down. They funded studies that downplayed addiction rates. They cherry-picked data that made codeine look safer than it was. They sponsored continuing medical education courses where doctors were taught to treat pain aggressively and prescribe opioids liberally. They paid key opinion leaders, respected physicians and researchers, to speak positively about codeine at medical conferences and in medical journals. They lobbied hard against stricter regulations. When the FDA proposed tighter controls on codeine in the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies pushed back with armies of lawyers and lobbyists. They argued that codeine was essential for public health, that restricting it would cause unnecessary suffering, that the risks were minimal and manageable. They marketed codeine to wider and wider audiences: children, the elderly, athletes, anyone with a cough or a twinge of pain. Advertisements appeared in medical journals showing happy patients, grateful families, productive workers, all thanks to codeine. The subtext was clear. Prescribing codeine made you a good doctor, withholding it made you cruel, and when addiction rates climbed, they blamed patients, called them drug seekers, accused them of misuse, suggested that the problem wasn't the drug but the people taking it. This victim blaming became industry standard. If someone became addicted to codeine, it wasn't because codeine was addictive. It was because that person had an addictive personality or a predisposition to substance abuse, never once admitting that the system itself, the prescriptions, the marketing, the accessibility, was designed to create dependency. It wasn't an accident. It was a business model, and it worked for decades. The parallels to the later opioid crisis with oxycodone are striking. Purdue Pharma's aggressive marketing of OxyContin in the 1990s followed a playbook that had been established decades earlier with codeine. The same tactics: minimize addiction risks, maximize prescribing, blame patients when things go wrong, and profit enormously while the bodies pile up. But while Purdue Pharma eventually faced massive lawsuits, criminal charges, and bankruptcy, the companies that pushed codeine for decades largely escaped accountability. They operated in an earlier era, before the scrutiny was as intense, before the lawsuits were as aggressive, before the public was as aware. They made billions, created millions of dependencies, and walked away mostly unscathed. Some internal documents from pharmaceutical companies revealed truly disturbing insights. Marketing executives discussed codeine's repeat customer potential. Sales representatives were trained to counter doctors' concerns about addiction with rehearsed responses that minimized risks. Research departments were instructed to design studies that would produce favorable results, and when studies showed negative outcomes, they were quietly shelved, never submitted for publication. The corporate cover-up wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It didn't require secret meetings or coded messages. It was just capitalism doing what capitalism does, maximizing profit, and minimizing liability, and treating human suffering as an acceptable externality. the cost of doing business. And when the truth finally started coming out, through investigative journalism, through lawsuits, through whistleblowers, the company's response was predictable. Deny, deflect, settle quietly, and move on to the next product. Because accountability in the pharmaceutical industry is rare. Fines are just the cost of doing business. And as long as the profits outweigh the penalties, the calculus doesn't change. The corporate cover-up surrounding codeine was both a blueprint and a warning. It showed how easily the medical system could be manipulated, how vulnerable patients were to exploitation, and how long harm could continue before anyone with power decided to stop it. Decades of suffering, generations of dependency, there's billions in profit, and barely a whisper of accountability. As opioid overdoses skyrocketed, one drug emerged as a lifesaver: naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist, meaning it blocks opioid receptors and can reverse an overdose in minutes. A person who had stopped breathing, whose lips had turned blue, who was minutes from death, could be brought back with a single injection or nasal spray of naloxone. It became a critical tool for first responders, healthcare workers, and even family members of opioid users. Paramedics carried it, emergency rooms stocked it, and increasingly, ordinary people, friends, parents, harm reduction workers learned to administer it and kept it on hand just in case. But here's the bitter irony. Naloxone wouldn't be necessary if opioids like codeine hadn't been overprescribed, overmarketed and underregulated for a century. Naloxone was treating the symptoms of a crisis that should never have happened in the first place. It was a band-aid on a bullet wound, necessary, life-saving, but a stark reminder of how badly things had gone wrong. Still, naloxone saved thousands of lives. It gave people second chances. It allowed someone who overdosed to wake up to get help to try again. It became a symbol of a public health approach to addiction, one that treated overdose as a medical emergency, not a moral failing. Some states began distributing naloxone kits for free. Community organizations set up training sessions teaching people how to recognize an overdose and administer naloxone. Pharmacies started stocking it over the counter in many states, meaning you could walk in and buy it without a prescription. Schools trained staff to administer it, recognizing that opioid use had reached even young people. There was pushback, of course. Some people argued that making naloxone widely available would encourage drug use, that it removed consequences, that it enabled addiction. This argument was both cruel and scientifically wrong. Studies showed that naloxone access didn't increase drug use, it just prevented deaths. And from a harm reduction perspective, keeping someone alive was always the first priority. You can't recover if you're dead. The naloxone revolution also sparked important conversations about how we treat addiction. For too long, addiction had been seen as a criminal justice issue, like something to be punished rather than treated. But naloxone reframed it as a health issue. Overdose was a medical emergency, addiction was a chronic disease, and the appropriate response wasn't jail, it was treatment, support, and compassion. But naloxone wasn't a cure. It reversed the immediate effects of an opioid overdose, but it didn't address the underlying dependency. Someone revived with naloxone would wake up in withdrawal, shaking, sweating, nauseated, and still addicted. They'd need follow-up care, treatment options, support systems, and too often those things weren't available. Still, naloxone represented a shift in thinking. It acknowledged that we were in a crisis, that people were dying, and that we had a responsibility to do something about it. It wasn't a solution to the opioid epidemic, but it was a start. A recognition that lives were worth saving, even if those lives belonged to people struggling with addiction. And for families who had lost loved ones to overdoses, naloxone became both a source of hope and a source of pain. Hope that maybe it would save someone else, pain that it hadn't been available or hadn't been used in time to save their own child, their sibling, their parent. The naloxone revolution saved lives, but it also highlighted how many lives had already been lost and how many of those deaths had been entirely preventable. Here's something most people don't know. How codeine affects you depends on your genetics, specifically on variations in the CYP2D6 enzyme, which is responsible for converting codeine into morphine in your liver. And here's the terrifying part. This genetic variation can mean the difference between codeine doing nothing and codeine killing you. Some people are poor metabolizers. They lack sufficient CYP2D6 enzyme activity, which means their bodies barely convert codeine into morphine. For them, codeine doesn't work well. They take it for pain and nothing happens. They might as well be taking sugar pills. These people make up about 5 to 10% of certain populations, particularly those of European and Middle Eastern descent. Others are normal metabolizers. Their bodies convert codeine to morphine at the expected rate, and they get the intended therapeutic effect: pain relief, cough suppression, a manageable level of sedation. This is the majority of people, and this is the group that codeine dosing guidelines are based on. But then there are ultra-rapid metabolizers. For them, codeine converts into morphine far too quickly and in dangerously high amounts. Their bodies are so efficient at the conversion that even a standard dose of codeine can flood their system with morphine, putting them at serious risk of overdose, respiratory depression, and death. Ultra-rapid metabolizers make up about 1 to 7% of certain populations, with higher rates in people of North African, Middle Eastern, and Ethiopian descent. This genetic variation affects how every single person responds to codeine, but for decades, no one tested for it. Doctors didn't know. Patients didn't know. Children died because of it. The medical community became fully aware of this problem in the 2000s when case reports began piling up. Children who died after routine surgeries, and despite being given standard doses of codeine, toxicology showed sky-high morphine levels. Genetic testing revealed they were ultra-rapid metabolizers. What was supposed to be a safe painkiller had become a lethal dose. It wasn't just children. Adults who were ultra-rapid metabolizers also faced increased overdose risk, but they were more likely to survive simply because of their size. Still, many experienced severe side effects: extreme sedation, confusion, dangerous drops in blood pressure, and respiratory depression that required emergency intervention. The genetic lottery of codeine metabolism is a perfect example of how personalized medicine should work, and how, for too long, it didn't. We prescribed drugs based on averages, on population-level data, without accounting for individual genetic variation, and people paid the price. By the 2010s, genetic testing for CYP2D6 became more available, though it still wasn't routine. Some hospitals began testing patients before prescribing codeine, especially children. Some countries, like the United States, recommended against using codeine in children entirely, recognizing that the risk wasn't worth it when safer alternatives existed. But worldwide, codeine is still prescribed without genetic testing. Millions of people take it without knowing whether their bodies will handle it safely or turn it into a poison. The genetic lottery continues, a game of chance where the stakes are life and death, and most players don't even know they're playing. The lesson here is simple but devastating. A drug that's safe for most people can be deadly for some, based entirely on genetics they can't control. And for a century, we prescribed codeine to everyone as if we were all the same, as if biology didn't vary, as if the genetic lottery didn't exist. It did. It does. And people died because we ignored it. Quitting codeine isn't as simple as just stopping. When your body has become dependent, stopping cold turkey triggers withdrawal, a brutal, flu-like experience that can last days or even weeks. And while codeine withdrawal isn't as intense as withdrawal from stronger opioids like heroin or fentanyl, It's miserable enough to make people give up and go back to the pills. The symptoms start within 6 to 12 hours of your last dose. First comes the anxiety, a creeping, irrational dread that something is terribly wrong. Your heart races, your mind spins, you can't sit still. Then comes the physical symptoms, muscle aches that make your whole body feel like it's been beaten with a bat, sweating, even when you're cold, chills, even when you're hot. Your temperature regulation is completely shot. Nausea hits next, waves of it, accompanied by stomach cramps and diarrhea. You can't keep food down, water tastes wrong, everything makes you feel sicker, your nose runs constantly, your eyes water, you yawn compulsively, even though you're nowhere near sleep. In fact, sleep is impossible. You lie in bed, exhausted, desperate for rest, but your mind won't shut off and your body won't stop aching. The psychological symptoms are just as bad. Depression crashes over you like a wave. Everything feels hopeless. You're convinced you'll never feel normal again. Irritability makes you snap at everyone around you. And the cravings. Oh, the cravings. Your brain screams for the drug, promising that just one more pill will make it all stop. And it would. That's the trap. Codeine withdrawal lasts about a week at its peak, though residual symptoms, insomnia, depression, fatigue, can persist for weeks or even months. It's not life-threatening like alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, which can cause seizures and death. But it's miserable enough to break people. Miserable enough to make them give up on quitting. Miserable enough to send them back to their pills, their doctors, their dealers. And that's exactly why withdrawal is such an effective trap. Your body holds you hostage. It punishes you for trying to quit. And unless you have support, medical supervision, and often medication to ease the process, withdrawal becomes an insurmountable barrier. Some people taper off slowly, reducing their dose gradually over weeks or months. This minimizes withdrawal symptoms and gives the brain time to readjust, but it requires discipline, support, and often medical oversight. And many doctors aren't trained in how to properly taper patients off opioids, so people are left to figure it out themselves, cutting pills in half, trying to stretch prescriptions, riding out the discomfort alone. Others use medication-assisted treatment. Drugs like buprenorphine or methadone can ease withdrawal symptoms and reduce cravings, allowing people to stabilize and begin recovery without the agony of cold turkey. But access to these treatments isn't universal. Many areas lack providers who can prescribe them. Insurance doesn't always cover them, and stigma surrounds them. Thus, people see medication-assisted treatment as just replacing one drug with another, not understanding that it's medical management of a chronic disease. The truth is, withdrawal is one of the biggest barriers to recovery. It's why so many people relapse. It's why addiction feels inescapable. And it's why treating opioid dependency requires more than willpower. It requires medical support, compassionate care, and an understanding that withdrawal isn't a moral test. It's a physiological process that needs to be managed, not endured. For decades, people going through codeine withdrawal were told to tough it out, that suffering was part of paying for their mistakes. That attitude was cruel and counterproductive. Withdrawal isn't penance, it's biology. And until we started treating it as such, countless people suffered unnecessarily, and many never made it to the other side. Here's the impossible question. How do you manage pain without opioids? Because for all the harm codeine and other opioids have caused, they do work. They relieve suffering, and for people living with chronic pain, from arthritis, cancer, nerve damage, injuries, opioids can be the difference between functioning and agony. The backlash against opioids, while necessary, has created a new problem. Patients who genuinely need pain relief are being cut off, denied prescriptions, treated with suspicion. Doctors, afraid of regulatory scrutiny and liability, have become reluctant to prescribe opioids at all. Pain management clinics have shut down. Patients who had been stable on long-term opioid therapy for years suddenly found themselves forced to taper or go cold turkey. Some of these patients have turned to suicide, unable to bear the pain, unable to access the medication that allowed them to function. They saw no other way out. Others self-medicate with alcohol, which is often more dangerous and less effective. Some turn to street drugs, heroin, fentanyl, which carry even greater risks. And many simply suffer, their quality of life destroyed, their ability to work or care for themselves gone. The pain management dilemma is real. We swung too far in one direction, prescribing opioids too liberally, creating an epidemic of dependency and death. Now we're swinging too far in the other direction, denying pain relief to people who need it, creating an epidemic of suffering. The answer isn't to ban codeine or opioids entirely, it's to prescribe them responsibly. That means assessing patients individually, not with blanket policies. It means monitoring for signs of dependency. It means educating patients about risks and setting realistic expectations. It means having uncomfortable conversations about the trade-offs between pain relief and dependency risk. And it means investing in alternatives. Non-opioid medications like gabapentin, duloxetine, and topical analgesics can help some patients. Physical therapy, when accessible and properly applied, can reduce pain and improve function. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches people to manage pain differently, to change their relationship with it rather than trying to eliminate it entirely. Interventional procedures, nerve blocks, spinal cord stimulators, radiofrequency ablation can provide relief for specific types of pain. Acupuncture, massage, and other complementary approaches work for some people, but all of these alternatives require investment in research, in training, in insurance coverage, in patient access. The healthcare system has historically been better at prescribing pills than providing comprehensive pain management. Pills are cheap, quick, and easy. They require a 5-minute appointment and a script pad. Physical therapy requires weekly sessions over months. CBT requires specialized training and lengthy appointments. Interventional procedures require equipment and expertise, and insurance companies often balk at covering these more expensive, time-intensive options. So doctors fall back on what's easy: prescriptions. And when opioids become too risky to prescribe, they prescribe other things that also carry risks. Or they prescribe nothing at all and leave patients to suffer. The pain management dilemma doesn't have an easy answer, but it requires acknowledging that pain is real, that suffering matters, and that the goal isn't to eliminate all opioid use, it's to use them appropriately, carefully, and with full awareness of the risks. Some people will need long-term opioid therapy. That's okay, as long as it's monitored, as long as alternatives have been tried, and as long as the patient understands what they're signing up for. The tragedy of the opioid crisis is that it's made pain management harder for everyone, for patients who need help, for doctors trying to do the right thing, and for a healthcare system that still hasn't figured out how to balance compassion with caution. When codeine became harder to get legally, people found other ways. The black market for codeine exploded, fueled by online pharmacies, dark web dealers, and international smuggling. You could order codeine from overseas, no prescription needed, shipped directly to your door in discreet packaging that looked like a birthday present from a relative you'd never met. It was risky. Sometimes the pills were counterfeit, laced with fentanyl or other deadly substances. Sometimes they were just sugar pills, and you'd paid $50 for nothing. Sometimes the package never arrived, intercepted by customs, and now your name was on a list somewhere. But for people desperate to avoid withdrawal or manage pain, it was worth the gamble. The rise of cryptocurrency made it even easier. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital currencies allowed transactions to happen anonymously. No credit card trail, no bank records. Just a digital wallet and a vendor with a good rating on a dark web marketplace. Sellers operated with relative impunity, shipping from countries with lax pharmaceutical regulations, India, Pakistan, Eastern Europe, to customers worldwide. Online pharmacies proliferated. Some were semi-legitimate, requiring you to fill out a questionnaire that was reviewed by a licensed physician before approving your order. These questionnaires were jokes. You could claim any symptoms, any history, and approval would come through in minutes. The licensed physician was probably a bot or someone in a call centre halfway around the world, rubber-stamping orders for a percentage of sales. Other online pharmacies didn't even pretend to be legitimate. They sold codeine, morphine, oxycodone, Xanax, Valium, anything you wanted, in whatever quantity. The websites looked professional, complete with fake testimonials, stock photos of smiling doctors, and reassuring language about quality and discretion. But they were fronts, operated by criminal organizations that saw the opioid crisis as a business opportunity. The black market for codeine wasn't new. There had always been people selling pills they didn't need to people who wanted them. But the internet made it global, accessible, and horrifyingly efficient. A teenager in suburban Ohio could order codeine from a supplier in Mumbai without leaving their bedroom. A retiree in Florida could buy pills from a vendor in Prague. Geography became irrelevant. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. The dark web was designed to be anonymous. Cryptocurrency transactions were difficult to trace. And even when authorities shut down one marketplace, 3 more would pop up to take its place. It was whack-a-mole on a global scale, and the moles were winning. The black market also created new dangers. Quality control didn't exist. Pills ordered online might contain what they claimed, or they might contain something entirely different. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin, began appearing in counterfeit pills in the 2010s. People thought they were taking codeine or oxycodone, and ended up dead from fentanyl overdoses. The pills looked identical, same shape, same colour, same markings, but they were lethal. Street-level dealers also got into the game. In cities across America, you could buy codeine cough syrup from someone who knew someone who worked at a pharmacy and would skim bottles off inventory, or from someone who doctor shopped, getting prescriptions from multiple physicians and selling the surplus. The markup was substantial. A bottle that cost $10 at the pharmacy could sell for $50 or $100 on the street. The black market thrived because legal access was restricted, but demand remained constant. People who were cut off by their doctors, who couldn't afford to see a physician, or who were too ashamed to admit they needed help, turned to illegal sources. And once you entered that world, it was hard to get out. You were now a criminal, at risk of arrest, overdose and exploitation. The black market for codeine was a symptom of a larger failure, a failure to manage pain appropriately, to treat addiction compassionately, and to create systems that helped people rather than pushing them into shadows. As long as demand existed and legal access was difficult, the black market would thrive, and people would keep dying in the process. By the late 2010s, the full scope of the opioid crisis was undeniable. Lawsuits were filed against pharmaceutical companies. Multi-billion-dollar settlements were reached. Some executives faced criminal charges. The narrative shifted. Opioids weren't miracle drugs. They were a public health disaster. Codeine, while less demonized than oxycodone or fentanyl, was part of that story. A quieter player maybe, but a player nonetheless. It had been the entry drug for many, the safe opioid that introduced people to dependency, paving the way for stronger and more dangerous substances. The legal reckoning was dramatic. Purdue Pharma, maker of OxyContin, faced thousands of lawsuits from states, cities, and individuals. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue, became a symbol of corporate greed and moral bankruptcy. In 2019, Purdue declared bankruptcy as part of a settlement worth billions. Members of the Sackler family agreed to pay additional billions out of their personal fortunes, though they admitted no wrongdoing. Other pharmaceutical companies followed. Johnson & Johnson, Teva, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and McKesson all faced litigation and settled for billions. The money was earmarked for addiction treatment, prevention programs, and support for communities devastated by the opioid crisis. But the reckoning wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Society began to understand that addiction wasn't a moral failing, but a disease, one that required treatment, not punishment. That understanding came too late for many. The hundreds of thousands who had already died, the families torn apart, the communities destroyed. But it came. The medical community also faced a reckoning. Medical schools began teaching more about addiction, pain management, and the risks of opioid prescribing. Professional organizations issued new guidelines urging caution, emphasizing non-opioid alternatives, and recommending screening for dependency risk before prescribing. Some states implemented mandatory continuing education on safe opioid prescribing for all physicians. Prescription drug monitoring programs became standard. These databases tracked controlled substance prescriptions across providers and pharmacies, making it harder for people to doctor shop. Doctors could check a patient's prescription history before writing a new script, and red flags would appear if someone was getting opioids from multiple sources. Naloxone distribution expanded dramatically. First responders carried it. Family members kept it at home. Some states passed Good Samaritan laws protecting people who called 911 during an overdose from being prosecuted for drug possession, encouraging people to seek help rather than letting someone die out of fear of arrest. Medication-assisted treatment became more widely accepted, though still not universally accessible. Buprenorphine, methadone, and naltrexone, medications that reduce cravings and ease withdrawal, were increasingly recognized as essential tools in treating opioid dependency. The old abstinence-only model was giving way to a harm reduction approach that prioritized keeping people alive and stable. But the reckoning was incomplete. While Purdue Pharma and a handful of others faced consequences, dozens of companies that had pushed opioids for decades faced little accountability. The Sacklers paid billions but remained billionaires. No executives went to prison for long sentences. The fines, while substantial, were often less than the profits made from opioid sales. And codeine? It largely escaped scrutiny. Because it had been around so long, because it wasn't as potent as other opioids, because it existed in a grey zone between medicine and drug, codeine didn't generate the same outrage. But it had played its role, introducing millions to opioid dependency, normalizing daily opioid use, and priming people's brains for stronger substances. The reckoning acknowledged the crisis. It assigned some blame. It directed some resources towards solutions. But it didn't undo the damage. It didn't bring back the dead. And it didn't fully prevent the next crisis from brewing. Because as long as profits matter more than people, as long as corporations can externalize the costs of their products onto society, the cycle will repeat. Different drug, same story. So where are we now? In 2025, codeine is still prescribed, still used, but under much tighter scrutiny. Many countries have moved it to prescription-only status. Some have pulled it from pediatric use entirely. Awareness of its risks is higher than ever. In the United States, codeine prescriptions have declined significantly over the past decade. Doctors are more cautious, more aware of dependency risks, and more willing to try alternatives. Guidelines from organizations like the CDC and the American Academy of Family Physicians now recommend against using codeine as a first-line treatment for most conditions. In Europe, the European Medicines Agency issued restrictions on codeine use in children in 2013 following reports of fatal overdoses. Many European countries require prescriptions for any codeine-containing product. eliminating the over-the-counter availability that had fueled abuse. In developing countries, the picture is more mixed. Some, like Nigeria, have banned codeine-containing cough syrups entirely after witnessing devastating abuse epidemics. Others still sell it with minimal restrictions, and the cycle continues: cheap, accessible, and quietly addictive. But codeine is still out there, still in medicine cabinets, still being taken by people who don't fully understand what they're swallowing. Some are managing legitimate pain, some are dependent without realizing it. Some know exactly what they're doing and can't stop. Pharmaceutical companies have largely shifted their focus to other products. The intense scrutiny on opioids has made them less profitable and more legally risky. But codeine persists because it's generic now, no longer under patent, produced by multiple manufacturers, cheap and ubiquitous. It doesn't have a villain like the Sackler family attached to it. It's just there. The conversation around codeine today is more nuanced. It's recognized as an opioid, with all the risks that entails, but it's also recognized as having legitimate medical uses when prescribed appropriately. The key word is appropriately, short-term use. Lowest effective dose, careful monitoring, and frank conversations about dependency risk. Alternative treatments have gained ground. For cough, medications like dextromethorphan and benzonatate have largely replaced codeine. For mild to moderate pain, NSAIDs like ibuprofen, acetaminophen, and topical analgesics are first-line treatments. Codeine has become a second or third-line option, reserved for cases where other treatments have failed. Still, millions of people worldwide take codeine every day. For some, it's the only thing that makes their pain manageable. For others, it's a dependency they can't escape. And for a few, it's the drug that will eventually kill them, either through overdose, through progression to stronger opioids, or through the long-term health consequences of chronic opioid use. The story of codeine isn't over. It's just evolved. From miracle drug to cultural icon to cautionary tale. It's a reminder that medicine is never neutral, that every drug is a trade-off, and that the line between relief and dependency is thinner than we'd like to admit. Codeine in 2025 is a drug caught between its past and its future, less celebrated than it once was, more restricted than it used to be, but still present, still prescribed, and still capable of both helping and harming in equal measure. What if we didn't need codeine at all? That's the question researchers are racing to answer. New pain medications are in development, drugs that target pain pathways without hitting opioid receptors, reducing the risk of addiction. One promising area is targeting specific sodium channels involved in pain transmission. Drugs that block Navone 0.7 sodium channels, for example, could provide pain relief without the euphoria, respiratory depression, or addiction potential of opioids. Early trials have shown mixed results, but the research continues. The challenge is that pain pathways are complex, redundant, and deeply integrated with other neurological functions. Block one pathway, and the body often finds another. It's like trying to stop a river by building a single dam. The water just finds a way around. Another approach involves targeting the endocannabinoid system, the body's natural pain and mood regulation system. Unlike opioids, cannabinoids work through different receptors and carry different risks. Medical cannabis has shown promise for certain types of pain, particularly neuropathic pain, inflammatory conditions, and cancer-related discomfort. But it's not without its own complications, including dependency potential, cognitive effects, and legal restrictions in many areas. The research is promising but politically complicated, with federal prohibition in many countries limiting large-scale studies. Non-opioid options are also being used more frequently. Gabapentin and pregabalin, originally developed for seizures, are effective for neuropathic pain, the burning, shooting, electric shock sensation caused by nerve damage. They work by calming overactive nerves, though they come with their own side effects: dizziness, weight gain, cognitive fog, and increasingly their own abuse potential. People discovered that high doses of gabapentin could produce a mild euphoria, and suddenly, a supposedly non-addictive alternative was being diverted and abused. Duloxetine, an antidepressant, helps with chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia and diabetic neuropathy. It modulates serotonin and norepinephrine, neurotransmitters involved in both mood and pain perception. The connection between depression and chronic pain is well established. They often travel together, feeding off each other in a vicious cycle. Treating one often helps the other, which is why antidepressants have become pain medications and why chronic pain treatment increasingly involves mental health support. NSA IDs like ibuprofen and naproxen remain workhorses for inflammatory pain. They're effective, cheap, and widely available. But they're not harmless. Long-term use can cause stomach ulcers, kidney damage, and cardiovascular problems. People pop ibuprofen like candy, me unaware that exceeding recommended doses can land them in the emergency room with gastrointestinal bleeding or kidney failure. Every drug has risks. The question is always whether the benefits outweigh them. Topical analgesics, lidocaine patches, capsaicin cream, diclofenac gel provide localized relief without systemic effects. They work directly at the pain site, numbing nerves or reducing inflammation without entering the bloodstream in significant amounts. For certain types of pain, arthritis, muscle strains, localized nerve pain, they're remarkably effective. But they're limited. They can't touch deep tissue pain, internal pain, or widespread conditions. They're tools, not solutions. Non-pharmaceutical approaches are gaining traction too. Physical therapy, when properly applied, can reduce pain and improve function by addressing underlying musculoskeletal problems. A pinched nerve, a misaligned joint, a weak muscle causing compensatory strain, these are mechanical problems that often require mechanical solutions. Stretching, strengthening, manual therapy, and movement retraining can provide long-term improvement without drugs. But here's the catch. Physical therapy isn't a quick fix. It requires time, commitment, and often weeks of uncomfortable exercises. You have to show up twice a week for months. You have to do your home exercises even when they hurt. You have to trust the process when you're not seeing immediate results. In a culture that expects instant relief, that's a hard sell. Codeine works in 20 minutes. Physical therapy takes 20 sessions. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches people to change their relationship with pain. It doesn't make pain disappear, but it helps people cope, reducing suffering even when sensation persists. The distinction between pain and suffering is crucial. Pain is the signal, the nerve impulse saying something is wrong. Suffering is the emotional and psychological response to that signal, the fear, the catastrophizing, the despair. CBT targets the suffering, teaching people to respond to pain differently, to not let it dominate their lives. Mindfulness meditation, biofeedback, and acceptance and commitment therapy have all shown benefits for chronic pain patients. These approaches work by changing how the brain processes pain signals, essentially turning down the volume on the alarm system. And studies using brain imaging have shown that experienced meditators literally experience pain differently. The sensory component remains, but the emotional reactivity decreases. The pain is there, but it doesn't bother them as much. Interventional procedures offer targeted relief for specific conditions. Epidural steroid injections for back pain, delivered directly to the inflamed nerve root. Nerve blocks that temporarily or permanently interrupt pain signals from a specific area. radio frequency ablation that uses heat to deaden pain-transmitting nerves, providing relief that can last months or years. Spinal cord stimulators, surgically implanted devices that send electrical pulses to the spinal cord, interrupting pain signals before they reach the brain. These aren't appropriate for everyone, and they carry risks: infection, bleeding, as nerve damage, device malfunction. But for some patients, they provide substantial relief without daily medication. A woman with chronic back pain who couldn't function despite multiple surgeries gets a spinal cord stimulator and returns to work. A man with severe leg pain from nerve damage gets a nerve block and walks without limping for the first time in years. These are real results, life-changing interventions that don't involve opioids. Even simple things help: ice and heat therapy, gentle exercise, adequate sleep, stress reduction. Pain is complex, influenced by inflammation, nerve signals, emotions, sleep quality, stress levels, muscle tension, and a dozen other factors. Addressing pain comprehensively, treating the whole person rather than just prescribing a pill, often works better than drugs alone. But here's the challenge: alternatives require investment. They require time. Physical therapy takes weeks of sessions at $100 a pop. CBT requires trained therapists and motivated patients, often meeting weekly for months. Interventional procedures require specialized equipment, trained physicians, and hospital facilities. Spinal cord stimulators cost tens of thousands of dollars, and insurance companies, focused on short-term costs, often balk at covering these more expensive, time-intensive options. It's cheaper to prescribe codeine. A month's supply costs maybe $10 or $20. A physical therapy program costs hundreds or thousands. So the system defaults to pills, even though pills often create more problems than they solve, even though pills address symptoms without fixing underlying problems, even though pills can turn into dependencies that cost far more in the long run in healthcare costs, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and human suffering. The future of pain management might not include codeine, but we're not there yet. Getting there requires research funding to develop better alternatives, medical training that emphasizes comprehensive pain management rather than quick prescriptions, insurance reform that covers effective treatments even when they're expensive up front, and a fundamental shift in how we approach pain, from something to be chemically suppressed to something to be comprehensively managed. It requires accepting that pain management isn't one size fits all, that what works for one person might not work for another, and that finding the right combination of treatments often takes time, patience, thus and trial and error. It requires recognizing that some pain might not be completely eliminable, and that learning to function despite pain is sometimes the best outcome we can achieve. It's a long road. But given Codeine's century-long track record of creating dependency while providing only temporary relief, it's a road worth travelling. Because the alternative, continuing to rely on opioids as our primary pain management tool, is a road we've already travelled, and we know exactly where it leads. Every bottle of codeine represents a choice: relief now, risk later. For some, that trade-off is worth it. For others, it's a trap they never saw coming. The cost of comfort isn't just measured in dollars or overdoses, it's measured in lives disrupted, families broken, potential lost. It's the mother who can't get through the day without her pills, who started taking them after a C-section 8 years ago and never stopped. She's tried to quit 3 times. Each time, the withdrawal was unbearable. Not just the physical symptoms, but the emotional crash. The return of the original pain amplified, and the crushing realization that she didn't know how to be herself anymore without the chemical cushion. It's the teenager who started with cough syrup at a party, thought it was harmless because it was medicine, and discovered a high that made everything feel softer, slower, more manageable. 3 years later, He's got track marks on his arms because codeine wasn't enough anymore, and heroin was cheaper and easier to find. His parents don't understand how their straight-A student ended up stealing from them to feed a habit that started with a prescription. It's the patient cut off cold turkey by a nervous doctor who'd been prescribing codeine for 5 years, but suddenly panicked about DEA scrutiny and new state regulations. No taper plan, no referral to addiction medicine. Just, I can't prescribe this anymore. Good luck. Left to suffer through withdrawal alone, without medical support, punished for a dependency that the medical system created. It's measured in the quiet shame of hiding pill bottles in different rooms, so your spouse won't know how many you're taking. Of lying to loved ones about whether you took your medication today. Of crushing pills to make them hit faster. Of taking more than prescribed and then rationing at the end of the month when you run short. Of knowing you're dependent but not knowing how to stop, and being too ashamed to ask for help because addicts are weak and you're not an addict. You're just taking medicine. It's the panic when you realise you're running low. The mental calculation of whether you have enough to last until your next doctor's appointment. The relief, the shameful, overwhelming relief when the prescription is filled and you've got another month's supply. The cycle that repeats week after week, month after month, year after year, until you can't remember what normal felt like before the pills. It's measured in lost careers. The nurse who can't work anymore because her codeine use was discovered when she tested positive on a random drug screen. Never mind that it was prescribed. Never mind that she never diverted drugs or showed up impaired. The state nursing board suspended her license, and now she's fighting to get it back, paying for monitoring programs and drug tests. Her career in limbo because of a medication her doctor gave her. The construction worker who can't pass a drug test for a new job. The opioids show up every time, and no employer wants to take the risk, even though he's never missed a day of work, even though the codeine is prescribed for a legitimate back injury. He's stuck in a lower-paying job because codeine closed doors he didn't even know could close. The teacher who lost her license after her dependency became known, not because she was impaired in the classroom, but because the school board decided she was a liability, a bad example. Someone who couldn't be trusted around children. She'd been teaching for 15 years, had a spotless record, won teaching awards. None of it mattered once the word addiction entered the conversation. It's measured in broken relationships, partners who don't understand why you're not the person you used to be, who notice you're emotionally flat, disconnected, going through the motions but not really present, who try to talk to you about it and get defensiveness, anger, denial, who eventually stop trying and start planning their exit. Children who learn that mum's pills are more important than their soccer game, who notice that she always takes her medication before family events, before stressful conversations, before anything that might require emotional availability, who grow up understanding, without anyone saying it explicitly, that something is wrong but no one talks about it. Friends who drift away because you're not fun anymore, not really there even when you're sitting right there. Who stop inviting you to things because you always say yes and then cancel last minute. Who eventually give up because maintaining a friendship shouldn't be this hard. It's measured in health consequences that compound over time. Chronic constipation, a common opioid side effect that sounds trivial until you're dealing with it daily, the pain, the bloating, the dependence on laxatives, the embarrassment, the impact on quality of life. It's not life-threatening, but it's miserable, and it's a constant reminder of what the pills are doing to your body. Hormonal disruption leading to low testosterone in men, decreased libido, erectile dysfunction, loss of muscle mass, depression, fatigue. For women, irregular periods, decreased fertility, early menopause, decreased bone density in both sexes, increasing fracture risk. These effects are reversible if you stop taking opioids, but stopping isn't easy, and many people don't realize the damage until it's already done. Cognitive effects, the mental fog that makes it hard to concentrate, to remember things, to think as sharply as you used to. Decreased reaction time that makes driving riskier, makes work harder, makes you feel like you're operating at 70% capacity all the time. You know you're not as sharp as you used to be, but you need the pills to function, so you're stuck choosing between pain and performance. It's measured in opportunities not taken. The job offer in another state that you turned down because you couldn't imagine finding a new doctor who would prescribe what you need. The relationship that never developed because intimacy is hard when you're emotionally numbed by opioids. The hobbies abandoned because they don't bring joy anymore. Nothing does, really, except the absence of pain. Travel becomes complicated. You need to bring your pills, need to make sure you have enough for the trip, need to worry about whether they'll get lost or stolen. International travel is even worse. Some countries have strict laws about opioids, and you could end up arrested for carrying your own prescription medication. Your world shrinks. Possibilities narrow. The future becomes a flat horizon where nothing changes because change is too frightening. Change means new doctors who might not prescribe. Change means disruption to the careful routine you've built around your medication. So you stay stuck, not because you want to, but because moving forward feels impossible, and it's measured in money. The direct costs, prescriptions, doctor visits, the occasional emergency room trip when you run out early and go into withdrawal, but also the indirect costs, lost work days, disability claims, rehabilitation programs if you finally try to quit. The thousands spent on addiction treatment that insurance doesn't fully cover. The economic burden of opioid dependency on individuals is crushing. The burden on families is often worse. Savings drained, retirement plans delayed, college funds emptied, all to pay for medical costs related to a medication that was supposed to help. And the burden on society? Billions in healthcare costs, lost productivity, disability payments, criminal justice involvement, and prevention programs trying to prevent others from falling into the same trap. But perhaps the highest cost is existential, living a life defined by a chemical, by the presence or absence of a molecule in your bloodstream. Codeine promised comfort, relief from suffering, and it delivered for a while. That's the cruelest part. It actually worked at first. The pain really did get better. You really did feel relief. The problem is that the price kept rising. The comfort kept requiring higher doses. The relief became harder to achieve. And eventually the drug that was supposed to set you free from pain became the thing that imprisoned you. You're not taking it to feel good anymore. You're taking it to not feel awful. You're not managing pain, you're managing withdrawal. The drug meant to give you your life back has taken it over instead. Some people pay that price and eventually find their way out. They quit through tapering or cold turkey or medication-assisted treatment. They rebuild their lives, though they're never quite the same. Recovery leaves scars, physical, emotional, psychological, but they're alive and they're free, and that's worth the scars. Others pay the ultimate price. Overdose, intentional or accidental. Progression to stronger drugs that eventually kill them. Health failure from years of opioid use. Suicide, when the pain and the dependency and the shame become too much to bear. The cost of comfort in those cases was everything, and millions more are still paying. Still caught in the grey zone between managing pain and managing dependency. Between feeling okay and falling apart. They're functioning dependents. They go to work, they raise kids, they pay taxes, and every day they take their pills, and every day they pay the cost. Not dramatically, not visibly, just slowly, steadily, in ways that add up over years until they look back and realize how much they've lost. Codeine promised comfort, but comfort, it turns out, has a very high price. And once you start paying, it's very, very hard to stop. The bottle doesn't come with a warning label that says this drug will take over your life. But maybe it should, because for too many people, that's exactly what it does. Not everyone who takes codeine becomes addicted. Not everyone who becomes addicted stays that way. There are survivors and people who recognize their dependency, sought help, and clawed their way back to sobriety. Their stories are rarely told. The narrative around addiction focuses on the tragic, the overdoses, the destroyed lives, the families left behind, the bodies in emergency rooms and morgues. But survival stories matter too. They're proof that recovery is possible, that addiction doesn't have to be a life sentence, that people can reclaim their lives even after years of dependency. Take Sarah, a 42-year-old high school teacher who started taking Tylenol with codeine after back surgery. She followed her prescription exactly, took it as directed, never exceeded the dose, never sought it recreationally. But when it ran out, the pain returned, worse than before. That's hyperalgesia, the paradoxical increase in pain sensitivity caused by opioid use. Your nervous system, suppressed for weeks, rebounds with a vengeance when the drug is removed. So she called her doctor and got another prescription, then another. Within 6 months she was taking twice the recommended dose and lying to her doctor about her pain levels. She told herself it was still legitimate. The pain was real. She needed relief. And codeine was the only thing that worked. Within a year, she was seeing multiple doctors, filling prescriptions at different pharmacies, and spending hours each week managing her supply. She recognized she had a problem when she found herself counting pills at her daughter's 10th birthday party. While kids played in the backyard and parents chatted over cake, she was in the bathroom, and mentally calculating whether she had enough pills to get through the weekend. That moment of clarity, realizing that her daughter's birthday, a day she'd looked forward to and planned for weeks, was less important than her pill count, broke something open. It wasn't dramatic. There was no rock bottom, no overdose, no intervention. Just a moment of honest recognition. This is not who I want to be. This is not the mother I want my daughter to remember. She found an addiction medicine specialist through her insurance provider. The doctor didn't judge, didn't lecture, just treated her dependency as the medical condition it was. Together they developed a taper plan, slowly reducing her dose over 3 months. It was uncomfortable, sometimes miserable, but manageable with support. The doctor prescribed medications to ease withdrawal symptoms, clonidine for anxiety and sweating, ondansetron for nausea, trazodone for sleep. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in chronic pain and addiction. They worked on pain management strategies that didn't involve drugs, cognitive behavioral therapy to change a relationship with pain, mindfulness meditation to reduce stress and muscle tension, and gradual reintroduction to physical activity. Her back still hurt sometimes, but she learned to function despite it rather than constantly chasing complete pain relief. She joined a support group, not Narcotics Anonymous, which felt too focused on street drugs and didn't quite fit her experience, but a group specifically for people dependent on prescription medications. There, she met others like her, professional people, responsible people who'd followed doctors' orders and ended up trapped. The shared understanding was powerful. She wasn't weak. She wasn't broken. She was dealing with a predictable consequence of taking an addictive drug. 2 years later, she's still in recovery. She still manages her back pain with physical therapy, yoga, and non-opioid medications like topical diclofenac and occasional ibuprofen. She still goes to her support group monthly. She's still hypervigilant about anything that could lead back to opioids. She won't even take them after dental procedures, opting for higher dose ibuprofen instead. And she's still grateful she got out when she did. She knows it could have been worse. She sees the statistics, knows that prescription opioid users are 40 times more likely to use heroin. She could have been one of them. Instead, she caught herself early enough, had resources and support, and made it out. Or Marcus, a 28-year-old who got hooked on lean as a teenager in Houston. What started as recreational use at parties, purple drank in styrofoam cups, everybody sipping, feeling smooth and relaxed, became daily use within months. By 18, he was drinking bottles of codeine syrup every day, not to get high, but just to feel normal. He dropped out of community college after his first semester. Couldn't concentrate, couldn't motivate, couldn't do anything that didn't involve getting his syrup. Lost job after job, fast food, warehouse work, retail, because he'd show up late, nod off during shifts, or not show up at all. Burn through relationships. His girlfriend left when she realized he cared more about lean than about her. His friends drifted away when he stopped being fun and started being a liability. He hit bottom when he woke up in a hospital after an overdose. A friend had found him unconscious in his car, lips blue, barely breathing. Naloxone brought him back. The ER doctor told him bluntly, "You're going to die if you don't get help. Probably soon." Marcus, still foggy from the overdose and the naloxone, didn't argue. For the first time in years, he believed it. His family staged an intervention the next week. His mother, his aunts, his younger brother, all there, all crying, all begging him to go to treatment. He went. 90 days inpatient at a facility that specialized in opioid addiction, paid for by insurance and family contributions. Then 6 months in a sober living facility, sharing a house with 5 other guys in recovery, attending meetings, working a part-time job, slowly rebuilding. He credits medication-assisted treatment with saving his life. Buprenorphine, a partial opioid agonist that satisfies cravings without producing a high, took away the obsession that had controlled him for years. He'd spent every waking moment thinking about lean, where to get it, how to pay for it, when he could take his next dose. Buprenorphine gave him space to think about other things, to remember who he'd been before codeine, to imagine who he might become after. The medication wasn't a crutch, it was a tool. It allowed him to engage with therapy, to address the underlying issues that had made him vulnerable to addiction in the first place. Trauma from his father's death when he was 13, depression he'd never treated, social anxiety he'd self-medicated with lean. And buprenorphine stabilized his brain chemistry so he could do the hard work of recovery. Now he's 5 years sober. He's working as a peer support specialist at the same facility where he got treatment, helping others navigate the same path he walked. He's back in school, studying social work. He's rebuilding relationships with his family. He's alive. He's also acutely aware of his privilege. He survived because his family had resources, because he had insurance that covered treatment, because he had a place to go after rehab, because he had people who cared enough to intervene. Many of the guys he met in treatment didn't have those advantages. Some of them are dead now, some are back on the streets. A few made it out, but only a few. These survivors share common threads. They had support systems, access to treatment, weary and crucial moments of clarity where they realized they needed help and chose to seek it. Many also had financial resources, stable housing and family backing, advantages that made recovery possible. Recovery is hard enough with those advantages. Without them, it's nearly impossible. Survivors also talk about what they've lost and gained. Lost years, time they'll never get back, spent in a chemical fog. Damaged relationships that may never fully heal. Health problems that persist despite sobriety. Legal consequences that follow them. Employment gaps that are hard to explain. The subtle ways dependency changes you, scars you, marks you even after you stop using. But also gained perspective that can only come from hitting bottom and climbing back up. Compassion for others struggling with addiction, born from a lived experience, a resilience forged in the crucible of withdrawal and recovery, a second chance at life that they don't take for granted. Many say they're grateful for their addiction, not for the suffering it caused, but because it forced them to confront things they'd been avoiding, to grow in ways they never would have otherwise, to become more authentic versions of themselves. They're also acutely aware that they're lucky. They survived when others didn't. They got help when help was available. They had resources and support that many people never have, and that awareness drives many of them to advocacy, pushing for better treatment access, fighting stigma, supporting others still struggling, and speaking publicly about their experiences despite the risk to their reputations. The survivor stories matter because they counter the narrative of hopelessness. They show that people can recover, that treatment works, that addiction doesn't have to be a death sentence. They're living proof that the other side exists, even when it seems impossibly far away. They're not perfect. Many relapse, sometimes multiple times before achieving stable recovery. Relapse rates for opioid addiction are similar to those for other chronic diseases, about 40 to 60%. But relapse isn't failure, it's part of the process. Each attempt at recovery teaches something. Each time you try again, you learn what works and what doesn't. Eventually, for many people, something clicks. The survivors of codeine addiction are heroes in the quietest sense. They didn't save the world, they just saved themselves. And in doing so, they lit a path for others to follow. They're proof that recovery is possible, that tomorrow doesn't have to look like yesterday, and that people are stronger and more resilient than they often believe. In a crisis defined by death and despair, their stubborn insistence on survival is an act of rebellion, and their voices sharing hope in the darkness might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to try one more time. So tonight, as you settle into your bed, your clean, comfortable bed, with pillows that don't smell like hay and sheets that aren't shared with livestock, maybe take a second to think about codeine. Not the brand name, not the bottle in your cabinet that you've had since that root canal in 2012, but the molecule itself, the quiet opioid that spent over a century convincing the world it was harmless. Then think about the millions of people who took it exactly as prescribed and ended up dependent anyway. The children who died because no one tested their genetics. The teenagers who sipped cough syrup at parties and woke up 3 years later with needles in their arms. The mothers, fathers, workers, teachers, nurses, ordinary people living ordinary lives who discovered that relief and dependency were two sides of the same pill. Think about the pharmaceutical companies that knew codeine was addictive and marketed it as safe anyway. The doctors who prescribed it liberally because that's what they were taught. The regulators who moved too slowly while people died. The system that created millions of dependencies and then blamed the patients for becoming dependent. Because here's what codeine teaches us. If we're willing to listen, trust is precious, and it's been betrayed. For over 100 years, we trusted that prescribed meant safe, that legal meant harmless, that medicine meant healing. And codeine proved, again and again, that none of those assumptions were true. It also teaches us that history repeats when we refuse to learn from it. Laudanum, morphine, heroin, codeine, oxycodone, fentanyl, different drugs, same story. Each one marketed as safer than the last. Each one creating an epidemic. Each one defended until the evidence became undeniable. We keep making the same mistakes because the incentives haven't changed. Profits still matter more than people. Convenience still trumps caution, and denial is still easier than accountability. But maybe, just maybe, codeine's story can serve as a warning for whatever comes next. Because there will be something next. There always is. Another drug promising relief without risk. Another company insisting this time is different. Another crisis brewing while we look the other way. The question is whether we'll recognize it before it's too late. Whether we'll demand honesty instead of accepting marketing. Whether we'll prioritize patient safety over corporate profits. Whether we'll remember that every opioid that's ever been called safe eventually proved otherwise. Codeine is still out there, still in medicine cabinets, still being prescribed, still helping some people and hurting others. The drug hasn't changed. Only our awareness has. And that awareness came at a terrible cost, measured in dependencies, overdoses, destroyed families, and lives cut short. So as you drift off tonight, maybe feel a little grateful. As grateful that you live in an era with naloxone, with addiction treatment, with growing understanding that dependency is a disease, not a moral failing. Grateful that you have choices codeine users of previous generations didn't have. Grateful that the conversation is finally shifting slowly toward honesty and harm reduction. But also feel a little angry. Angry that it took so long. Angry that so many people had to suffer before anyone with power decided to act. Angry that the lessons were there all along and we ignored them. Angry that profit mattered more than lives. Because Codeine's story isn't ancient history, it's still unfolding. People are still taking it right now, this very moment, some managing pain, some managing dependency, and some about to discover they can't tell the difference anymore. The bottle doesn't warn you when relief becomes addiction. It doesn't tell you when you've crossed the line. It just sits there quietly, waiting for the next refill, and somewhere, a pharmaceutical company is developing the next codeine, the next drug that will promise relief without consequences, the next molecule that will be marketed to millions before anyone fully understands its dangers, the next chapter in a story that keeps repeating because we refuse to learn its lessons. But you know now, you know Codeine's truth. You know that the opioid hidden in every medicine cabinet for 100 years wasn't hiding at all. It was right there in plain sight, doing exactly what opioids do. We just chose not to see it until millions of people paid the price. So sleep well tonight. Rest easy, but remember that medicine isn't always benign, that prescribed isn't the same as safe, that trusting blindly is dangerous, and that the most important question you can ask about any drug isn't whether it works, it's what it costs, not in dollars, but in everything else. Because codeine worked. It absolutely worked. It just cost more than anyone warned us it would. And we're still paying that bill. Some of us with our health, some with our freedom, some with our lives, and all of us with the uncomfortable knowledge that we could have prevented most of it, if only we'd been willing to look, to learn, and to change. Sweet dreams. And maybe tomorrow check your medicine cabinet. See what's lurking there. And ask yourself, do I really know what I'm taking? Or am I just trusting that someone else does? Because history has shown us, again and again, that trust without scrutiny can be deadly. And Codeine's 100-year reign as the safe opioid is proof that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we want to believe. Good night.